2, 1. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Scottish Liberty Podcast, episode 148 with myself, Tom Laird, and of course, my erstwhile colleague in Liberty.
Antony Sammeroff.
That's your cue, Antony.
All right, okay, got it.
Antony Sammeroff.
That's me.
Today, we have the return of a special guest that we had right in the beginning of when Antony and I started to do this show. We have comedian, playwright, comedy songwriter, and author of Daylight Robbery and Life After the State, Dominic Frisby. Dominic, welcome back to the Scottish Liberty Podcast.
Oh, thanks very much for having me back. It's great to hear from you.
Yeah.
Good stuff. Okay. You have, I can see you have on the wall behind you both Life After the State and Daylight Robbery, which I thoroughly recommend to anybody. The Daylight Robbery book, which you very kindly signed for me, now resides at my dad's house because I left it there before the lockdown. So I was about 2/3 of the way through it, But so don't ask me about anything in it after like about 2/3 of the way. But I was enjoying it thoroughly, and there was a lot of stuff in there that I felt I was fairly up to speed in this kind of stuff. But there was a lot of stuff that I didn't know as well, which is brilliant.
It's amazing when you look at the world through the prism of tax, and it's amazing how certain things start to make total sense that perhaps didn't make sense before, isn't it? Just things that have happened and why the world is as it is.
Could you give us?
I particularly enjoyed your chapter on the Civil War.
Oh yeah,
the American Civil War, I should say. Or
this is the American Civil War,
the War of Northern Aggression, as I prefer to call it.
This is the untold story of the American Civil War. Since the Civil War, it's been framed that the war was about slavery, and
which was, of course, a big thing.
It was a huge issue. It was a huge social issue at the time, but it was not why the two North and South went to war, because Lincoln just before
as they say.
Lincoln just before the war had said it was not his only intention was to preserve the Union, and that slavery could carry on in the South, and so on and so forth. And the untold, and the South did not want to go to war with the North. It knew it could never win. It was much smaller. Its population was much smaller. Its army was much smaller. It couldn't win. And Lincoln sort of provoked them into firing at Fort Sumter, and that was deliberate. And that's once those shots were fired at Fort Sumter, Lincoln had the power to go to war, and he had the moral high ground then. But Lincoln wanted to preserve the Union because something like 80 to 90% of tax revenue for the entire United States came from duties that were paid in the southern states.
Wow.
And Lincoln was terrified of losing the tax revenue, because if he lost it, and that money was then taken and used to effectively subsidize industries in the North. So there was a huge it's this 19th century equivalent of the American industrial military complex and the incredible lobbying power and power they have within the United States to effect government policy. But all those industries in the North, which were emerging and starting to compete with the British, wanted effectively tariffs on imported goods, which made their goods more attractive on a relative basis. And without those tariffs, they would have been undermined by British imports, which were better at that time. And so it's a little bit like what's going on with Chinese imports at the moment, and Trump trying to bolster American industry. But it's the untold story of the war, and it was probably a bigger factor in why the countries actually went to war. And Lincoln only did his Emancipation Act in whenever it was 62, I think it was. He only did it not because he wanted slaves to be free and he had this huge moral high ground. He did it because he was trying to create internal problems for the South, because at that point the South was doing rather well in the war, and at that he wanted to create internal problems and create slave rebellions within the southern states in order as a military tactic, in order that the southern armies would then have to go and deal with the rebellions, and then he couldn't fight the northern states. So the emancipation was less about freeing slaves and more about winning the war.
Right. So one of the things you said off the bat was the world becomes a very interesting place when you look at it through the prism of taxation. Could you give us a couple of examples of some of the most amazing things that you found out when you were researching the book about that bring the world into focus once you have that lens?
You can, like, the American Civil War is one example, but you can take pretty much any great event in human history, from the birth of Christ to the first men on the moon, to the defeat of Napoleon, to the French Revolution, the American Revolution, the birth of Judaism. You can take pretty much any event, and if you dig around, the birth, the rise of Islam, and if you dig around, there is almost always a tax story that has had a huge influence and often was the driving factor in that event. And if that wasn't that tax story, events would have never occurred in the way that they did. Taxation is as old, it goes all the way back, it's as old as civilization itself. You know, the very first taxes were enacted in ancient Mesopotamia, and they probably existed before in one form or another. And you can, like, I'll give you some examples. So if you take the birth of Christ, Mary and Joseph were only in Bethlehem because Augustus Caesar was levying a census, a tax. And if he wasn't doing that census or the tax, depending on the version of the story, but the census would have been a registration for tax purposes, so it's the same thing. Mary and Joseph would never have been in Bethlehem. And so Christ wouldn't have been born in Bethlehem, and Christianity would never have evolved in the way that it did. And the crime for which they eventually got Christ crucified was effectively forbidding to give tribute. In other words, encouraging people not to pay their taxes. That was the crime for which he was crucified. So Christ's birth and death is a tax story. First men on the moon, NASA was a tax-funded operation. Every single war in history, every single war is paid for by some kind of tax, either during or after the event. You conquer and then you plunder and then you tax. Every conquest is about taking control of the tax base, the land, the labor, the produce, the profits. Every revolution is a rising up against some kind of injustice perpetrated by the tax system. Tax is power. Without tax revenue, leaders have no power. And tax is control. And tax is a measure of freedom. And once you start to look at these things, you're like, oh, Christ, of course. And even, you know, the World War II, World War I, they were all made possible by taxes. It's bizarre that if you stopped tax, you would stop war. But at the same time, if you tax makes war possible, but war also makes tax possible. Leaders find it very hard to levy taxes in peacetime. But as soon as you've got some kind of crisis, they have the crisis they need in order to levy those taxes. And taxes very rarely go back to the level they were before the crisis started. So a good example, World War II, ordinary Americans didn't pay income tax. 1942 Revenue Act, to raise the money to pay for the war. It was your patriotic duty to pay these taxes. But then income tax never went away for ordinary Americans. It stayed there. So it was so it began, and you look at the financial crisis of 2008 gave us what Milton Friedman would call taxation without legislation, inflation, the debasement of currency, quantitative easing, zero interest rates, and all that kind of thing. You know, that became normal. And so here we are now in the midst of another crisis, this corona crisis, and we're seeing the most incredible money printing going on, and Lord knows where it's going to end up. But I think it's good. The difference in 2008, all the money printing went into the financial economy and bailed out the financial system. It never really entered the real economy, except in things like house prices in London and stuff like that. But this time around, the inflation is going to go into the real economy. And I don't know what the consequences are going to be, but I think we're going to see a considerable loss in the purchasing power of the pound. But you've seen all these other violations of basic liberties taking place that would just not be possible without this crisis. And I bet you, like now there's this land grab going on. I bet you we never return afterwards to the same levels of freedom that we had before the crisis started.
Yeah, that seems. I think that's probably going to be the case. Unfortunately, I mean, I'm sure I read something about this public health crisis somewhere in the media over the last couple of days.
Yeah.
Can I ask you guys a question? Go on.
No,
what's the libertarian? Go on, I'll go.
You go ahead. You go ahead.
Thank you. What is the libertarian risk? Because a couple of people asked me this and I haven't really thought it through. What in Libertaria, what would we have done to, what would the libertarian reaction to this pandemic have been?
Do you want to go first, Tom?
I'll let you go first if you've got a superlative answer.
Yeah, I think I don't have a superlative answer. It's a very difficult situation, and I've been listening to different libertarian talking heads, and there isn't exactly a consensus, but I can say a few things in comparison. One is that governments always come along after the fact and respond to crises the best they can, which is usually not ideal. It doesn't matter what anyone does under the current circumstances. It's not going to be ideal because the circumstances are unprecedented. And people then go along and say, well, you know, what would you do with criminals after in a free society? Or what would you do after the house is burnt down? But really, I think it's a little bit too late. And I can't say that in anarcho-capitalism, in a country without a state, that things would be handled perfectly. But one thing I think we know is, for example, one of the reasons why everyone is in so much debt and all the businesses don't have any capital stock, you know, they need bailed out by the government and things like that, is for decades and decades and decades, the government has had a policy of not only printing tons of money, but putting interest rates through the floor. So they've basically been encouraging people for decades to borrow cheap money and rack up debt. Anyone who was saving was basically victimized by the low interest rates. They weren't able to, they were discouraged from saving. They were punished for saving. Lord knows, you know, my dad can't take anything down from his pension, which he has already paid income tax on when he earned the money, without paying another tax on it, coming back to your stuff of tax. So one thing I want to say is the government has at least created a situation where no one actually has any savings, including all the corporations, to compensate for crises like this, which there's always going to be periodic crises for whatever reason. Maybe the weather, you know, maybe there's a flood, maybe there's a famine, you know, maybe there's a virus, maybe there's a new technology. We've created a situation where we've got no savings to actually respond to a crisis like this. So the economic consequences of this crisis are at least going to be a lot better than they would, a lot worse than they would be in a libertarian society. And I think it's important that when we compare apples to apples, because people always say, well, without government, how would you respond to this crisis? And I'm like, well, can you please not compare a society where everything's handled perfectly to a hypothetical society that would kind of have to have organic responses in place that we don't necessarily know, because it's not necessarily that this society's performing perfectly, but we should be comparing what we know to what we know, not like utopia to dystopia. Those are my preliminary thoughts. At least I think that the society would be more responsive. Some people are saying that there's a libertarian case for a lockdown. Personally, I think that the government's way overstepped the mark with it. Do you have anything from a different perspective, Tom?
No, I would pretty much go along with that. Possibly only to say that in not Libertopia, but Ancapistan, possibly every every part of society.
I've never heard that. Did you just invent that? Ancapistan.
Ancapistan. No, I'm sure it goes around.
Oh, that's hilarious.
There would. Good stuff.
I'm going to do a song. I got a fucking song. Show me the way to Ancapistan. I'm going to do that as a fucking song.
As long as we can come on as backing vocalists this time.
Ancapistan.
I think there wouldn't be one Ancapistan. There would be loads of Ancapistans within the UK. Yeah. So everybody would be dealing with this in their own way. And I think pretty rapidly it would become, Dominic's cracked up.
I just
I
love
wish I'd have
that.
invented it. I haven't. I've heard it somewhere else, but yeah. so yeah, there wouldn't be one Ancapistan. There'd be loads of Ancapistans all working on the problem, and the best system would become apparent rapidly.
Yeah, that's a good.
Yeah.
Both very good points. I mean, I'm pretty sure. Like it's funny, you know, you get when there's a sort of thing on the news. It's, you know, you talk about 6 degrees of separation. This one really is like 1 degree of separation.
Right.
You know, I know so many people that've had it, and people who aren't sure if they've had it, and some people have got off lightly, and some people have had it really badly. But it sounds pretty tough.
Yeah.
But the you know, I did a song on March the 10th in Comedy Unleashed. I did my Maybe song, and I did a verse about the coronavirus. And the thing was, maybe the fear is worse than the disease. Do we really need to bring the world to its knees? Something about mortality rates. And then the far greater harm comes from the alarm. And I'm sure the economic fallout and the damage it does to people's lives because of the reaction to this and because of the fear of the disease will be greater than the actual disease itself. And Cowperthwaite, who was the governor of Hong Kong, used to talk about the aggregation of individual decisions are far greater, is better, arrives at a better outcome than decisions taken by, you know, some government minister or some bureaucrat or whatever it is, some civil servant. And you wonder if the aggregation of individuals' decisions in the situation of a pandemic is better, because let's face it, few people, you know, there's plenty of news sources where you can go to get your news. It's not like we weren't informed. It wasn't like we weren't informed. And to be fair, there's a few kind of Bitcoin preppers who I know who were texting me back in January going, this is going to be really bad. You want to get out of the city, get to the country. There's going to be riots and stuff. Now, we're not quite at the riot stage yet, but, you know, I live in southeast London, lovely sandwich between Lewisham and Peckham, which are two of the kind of hot spots when we got the looting in whenever it was, 2011. And so, you know, it won't take a lot for things to kick off. So I wonder if that's coming. But at the moment, it's all very quiet. All feels very quiet. But yeah, so you wonder anyway if you know, warning people but letting them make their own minds up and you know, advising them maybe to wear masks or whatever, but the you wonder about that. Certainly your point, Antony, the system is too leveraged, and it's because of our system of debt-based fiat money. You know, it's just, everything is just about surviving till tomorrow. There's just too much leverage in the system, so it doesn't take a lot to unravel it. And you know, Ancapistan and Libertopia would never have been so leveraged in the first place, one hopes. Correct. So interesting points. But the other thing is, in Ancapistan, we not only would we be better prepared because we'd be less leveraged, there's more onus on the individual to behave responsibly. And so, you know, it breeds a different kind of psychology. So I wonder if that would mean we'd all take better responsibility to look after our own houses and our own families and so on, because the onus would be on us, because we know that there would be no government to bail us out.
Right, and we just heard that the Center for Disease Control in the USA had to relax its regulations because certain companies wouldn't have actually been allowed to develop drugs relating to this illness under the regulations that were in place. In fact, one company violated the CDC's regulations and said, well, you know, stuff you guys, we're going to develop medications because this is serious, which is what prompted the CDC to chuck the regulations out. So the government was actually, far from protecting people from this, was actually had a hand in slowing down progress when it came to these medications. Another thing I've been shocked on, I don't think I mentioned this on our last show. If I did, well, you're going to hear the story again, listeners. I was surprised on Facebook that a friend of mine in London who's a lefty was praising the government, but he was saying, don't go for me yet, but I think that the government's doing great and blah, blah. And he was calling maybe for more measures than they've already taken. And I left a comment saying, I love the fact that you're more worried about being criticized for this post because you're praising the Tories than you are for being criticized for the post because you're basically championing totalitarianism, which he was in the post, and saying would be a great idea. You know, I found that quite ironic.
There was I'm going to swear, and I'm just the reporter here. I'm not the. So let me just issue that
You're allowed
disclaimer.
To swear on this show. We always say.
Yeah, okay.
It's never bothered us before.
So, do you remember the London Bridge terrorist shootings that we had 2 or 3 years ago?
Yeah.
Right.
So there was a scene in one of the cafes where the guy's stabbing and shooting people in the restaurant, and everyone's hiding under the tables, absolutely petrified. As you can imagine, when there's a guy firing off guns and shooting people, and stabbing people. Can you imagine how frightened you'd be hiding under the table and having gone out for a meal in a restaurant? And somebody's videoing it on their phone. And you just hear somebody in the room go about the terrorist, "Oh, you Muslim cunt." Right.
Wow.
Which under the circumstances, I think that description is fair. Right? Because he was stabbing and shooting people. But nevertheless, you then heard somebody else.
That would come under cuntish behaviour in my book.
In mine too. Anyway, so this guy goes...
Somewhat cuntish. Yeah.
So somebody's going, "You Muslim cunt." At which somebody else goes, "You can't say that."
Wow, that's amazing. That is amazing.
And you're like, are you seriously like censoring people's speech while right in front of you there's a guy firing off a gun and stabbing people? And it was just like one of the most amazing exchanges I've ever heard. But anyway.
Yeah, so
it's that same thing of we're so het up in these stupid identity politics arguments that we forget the more important, bigger stuff that's going on.
Lives are at stake, yeah. And I think anyone who says, "Oh, you care more about the economy than people's lives," should be denied the vote from now on. That should be like, if your level of perception is so low that you think, yeah, I'm pretty sure that people were queuing for bread in the Weimar Republic because of the economy. And I think people threw themselves off buildings because of the Great Depression. So if you're so out of touch with reality that you don't think that the economy has anything to do with people's lives, I think that's good grounds for being denied suffrage.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think you got to.
This is
hey,
kind of...
you say suffrage. I'll give you another tax story.
Okay.
Okay, good stuff.
One of the biggest arguments for women being given the vote in 1918 and 1928, when the two acts were passed in Parliament, was the fact that women had replaced men in the workforce during World War I and had started paying tax. And the fact that they had paid tax into the system justified their being given a vote. And so even in something as apparently unconnected like women's suffrage, there is a tax story there.
Yeah. I mean, I think what baffles me about the lockdown and some of these measures is it seems strange to me that, I could be wrong, but it has happened before, like 1979 was the last time. But basically, if the Tories after we knew that this virus had broken out in China, had they have said something like, okay, from this moment on, we are restricting access to the UK from anybody from infected areas, I think people would have went nuts. They'd have went, that's draconian and fascistic and racist. You can't do that. But yet, that may have been arguably a more sensible step than the ones they're doing now. And I don't know if this is true. I was listening to Nigel Farage, your mate Nigel, and he was saying that Heathrow, planes are still coming into Heathrow, and people are still, from affected areas, and people are still getting off and just getting onto public transport and going about their business.
Man, I was in northern Italy 3 weeks ago. And
Okay.
like when I was there, and I was there, and they was closing down all the museums and stuff. It was kind of just breaking, and when I landed there, they were testing me when I landed in Venice airport, and then I went off and I was in Padua, which was sort of not quite in the epicenter, but oh look, you've just upgraded the meeting. The includes unlimited minutes. Antony, you splashing out here. So they weren't and then when I came back, I just went to Venice airport and got on the plane, flew into I can't remember if it was Heathrow or Gatwick. Oh no, it might have been, was it either Heathrow or Gatwick? Land, or was it City? I forget where it was, but anyway, it was Gatwick. I flew into Gatwick, landed, and got the Gatwick Express home. And nobody tested me, nothing. And I'd come right from the bloody epicenter of it.
Yeah.
Anyway. You irresponsible individual. Don't you know that the collective has rights that you need to respect?
What should I do? What should I do? Should I stay there?
We're sending you to the
gulag. I think you should look after my family.
I think you should dob yourself in. Yourself in. That's what you should do. But I mean, like, I take it. How is your kids, your family? Is everybody okay? Thank God so far.
Well, I've got a sort of rather extended family, and it's not your sort of traditional nuclear family. Let's put it that way. But my eldest two kids are 19 and 17, and they both live with me, and their mum lives about a mile up the road, and she has had it.
Oh wow.
And she has been quite ill with a thing called neutropenia, which means she's very in the vulnerable group. If she gets it, she's one of the people that it could really hurt.
High risk.
And she said it was like having really, really, really bad flu. And on top of that, having an elephant on her chest. She described it.
Right.
And she was, there's 3 or 4 times when she wanted to call an ambulance in the middle of the night because she couldn't breathe. And then for whatever reason decided not to. So she had it pretty badly. And we're not sure, me and the 2 kids aren't sure if she's now recovered, like in the last couple of days, she's just come out the other side. But me and the 2 kids aren't sure if like we're super spreaders and we've had it and it just didn't get us that badly, or if we haven't had it yet. My daughter's had a sort of cough, one of those tickly coughs that she's had it for about 2 weeks. I mean, it could just be a cough. I had a weird headache for about a week. It could just be a weird headache because I got a new set of glasses, so it could be that. And I've had a sort of slightly weird cough. And so you just don't know. Hal Cruttenden, another comic, he's had it quite badly. And my friend Gideon's had it quite badly. And so, but I mean, I've just been quite sensible, washing my hands. Well, I don't know what else do you do. I've been trying to lead my life as normally as I can under the circumstances. I've quite enjoyed it. I've lost about 4 kilos because of maximizing my daily exercise allotment. I've been walking the dog loads and running and doing exercise. It's sort of got me quite disciplined. I've got quite healthy. And I've quite enjoyed just being locked down with the kids.
Just like you, a capitalist, a heartless capitalist profiting off a crisis. Trust you.
It's funny though. I mean, when I go to the park and walk the dog, there's so many people out getting fit for the first time. I think a lot of people, a lot of lives are going to be, leave aside the economic damage and leave aside the loss of life. A lot of people are going to look back on this and with a certain amount of fondness. It's going to bring families together, bring loved ones together, that kind of thing.
Well, it really depends on how long it goes for, to be honest.
Yeah,
I mean, I can't say that I haven't been loving it. I've genuinely, hashtag love the lockdown. That's going out on Twitter. I've really been enjoying it, but maybe another 2 weeks or 3 weeks or so.
Yeah, we'll get bored after a while. Does your income depend on, have you got, what's your name? What do you call it? Some kind of subsidy have you lost any income because of it?
Well, I work online mostly anyway. I mean, I do have clients that I see in person, but they're the minority and they can still see me on Skype. So if anything, because my other activities have been cancelled, I've taken more people on. So I'm also a heartless capitalist profiting off the world's misery.
You're doing your, what do you call it, motivational stuff?
Well, I mean, yeah, I'm a counsellor.
Counselling.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Uh,
What about
Tom,
you, Tam? If you lost money because of it, what was?
Yeah, not to my knowledge. I mean, I was on 2.5 weeks holiday anyway. I mean, the lockdown only started after I took my holidays. So I was supposed to, I think I took 3 days and went up to Loch Tay. A friend of mine had some property up there. So I spent 3 days up there and then came back down. But I don't know yet. I'm going back to work tonight. And
All right.
I suppose I would loosely come under the key worker category. And I don't know yet what the situation is. It's transport industry, so I don't know what steps have been. I know that it's a reduced service. I don't know. Sorry.
Yeah, you're working on the trains, is it?
Yeah. So I don't know how it's going to affect my my rota or anything like that. I haven't heard anything, so I'll find out tonight. But I think I should be reasonably unscathed by this, providing I don't get it, obviously, which is always a possibility.
Yeah.
But like you, I think that the economic and fallout and the effects this will have on civil liberties in the long term will probably be worse than the actual virus itself. That's my take on it. Could be wrong, but I don't think so. And there's been some, fairly hard-hitting commentators like Peter Hitchens in the Mail on Sunday has come out and said, he thinks it's a way overreaction in proportion to what.
Yeah, and it's quite brave to do that, because as soon as you start speaking out against the government reaction, you're a heartless bastard.
Yeah.
You don't care about people's lives, and it's really easy to smear you. So I think a lot of people it's one of those where a lot of people might be thinking it, but they're keeping their mouths shut.
Yeah, and he did take a lot of hits for it, as you'd expect. There was a pretty funny...
Him and Delingpole are about the only two people who are arguing against what's going on.
I'm quite surprised that the Mail on Sunday actually put it out, because he's had articles of his spiked before, by the Mail on Sunday. He had a column, his column spiked before the Brexit vote, because he was coming out with too much stuff that the Daily, the Mail on Sunday weren't too keen on. So I'm surprised.
Was he a Leaver or Remainer? I think he was a Remainer.
No, I think he's basically a strange guy. What he said was, in the end, it won't really matter, because the people that are in charge are committed to the same sorts of programs as the EU are committed to. So it's not going to make that much of a difference. But I think on balance, he's anti-EU. But he just didn't think that it was going to make a hell of a difference.
All right. Yeah. He's been taking a lot of shit because he's not as good as his brother. I keep reading these horrible comments. You're not as good as your brother. Horrible thing to say.
Well, I'm a huge fan. I like Peter. I mean, I have problems with Peter Hitchens in a few areas, but by and large, I quite like him. I mean, he is bombastic. He does filibuster. He does, there's loads of things about him I don't like, and he is not. And I'm a better fan. I have more in common, I think, with Peter Hitchens and his worldview than I have with Christopher Hitchens. However, I think it's patently obvious that Christopher Hitchens was the more erudite, more entertaining of the two by a long shot, But
so, speaking of Peter Hitchens, once he wrote a column about the right to bear arms here in the UK, and as it so happens, one of our listeners asked, as a kind of libertarian-minded fellow, do you think we should have the right to bear arms in the UK like they do in the USA?
Ooh.
Is that to me, that question?
Yeah.
Oh, man, it's one of the things I completely fall down on the... just hang on one second, sorry. Okay. One of the things I thought about is, like, let's say we had a really bad government and you know, it was really totalitarian, and it issued all
Let's
these
say
rules that you couldn't.
Yeah.
It issued all these new rules that you can't go out, and you have to, you know, your freedom of movement is curtailed, and you have to take the government income. You can't go on transport, and if you do, policemen will start asking you questions. All this kind of thing. You know, where there was a situation where there was a serious erosion of civil liberties. Now, at other points in history, like say we lived in medieval times, you know, the king's army would have swords, but the rebel army could also get itself weapons that maybe not as good as the swords, but they would still be weapons that weren't in a completely, that was sort of roughly in the same league as the swords. And, you know, maybe some of the sword fighters would come on the rebel side. So there wasn't such a mismatch between the people and the authorities. Now, if we in Western Europe wanted to rise up against our totalitarian leaders and overthrow the system and replace it with something better.
Supposing we wanted to do that.
There is absolutely no means, and we voted for change and we didn't get the change, and you know, there was absolutely no means to enact the change we want through the ballot box, which let's face it, there isn't, because wherever you vote, you just get more of the same. We do not have, unless we have the right to bear arms, we do not have the ability to hold our leaders to account. Now, somewhere like in a country where people do have the right to bear arms, if there was a revolution, they're probably going to lose, but they stand a better chance if they could coordinate their revolution in the right way. So the fact that the people don't have a right to bear arms and the authorities do means there is an incredible mismatch between authority and people. And ultimately, it's impossible for the people to hold the authorities to account, either through the ballot box or through, you know, so that, I think about that quite a lot. And that is one of the arguments which, in my opinion, justifies the right to bear arms. And I don't think it's an argument you hear very often. But then I just look at America sometimes and you see all the shootings that go on. And you just go, do you really need guns? I mean, guys, do you really need guns? Is it just not worth just sacrificing the right to bear arms? Because, you know, because is it really worth this loss of life? Surely the loss of liberty is worth paying for the loss of life. And well, you know, I think I'm not saying that. I'm saying sometimes I think
that's Boris Johnson's exact argument.
Well, so, you know, I get that argument and I'm persuaded by that sometimes. And so I don't have a clear ideology on this. You know, I go to a Bitcoin conference and they're all into guns and stuff. And I'm all like, yeah, guns. And then you see what people do with guns and you're like, oh Christ, you really need guns? And I remember being like, I took my kids to Texas about 3 years ago and we hired a car in Houston and we drove around Texas. And within 48 hours of landing in Texas, my kids had eaten steak, driven a car, ridden a horse, and shot a gun within 48 hours of being there. And it was just brilliant. It was just so, and it was so, we went to a firing range and it was so scary. The guns are so loud, but I mean, you kind of get into it. Now, the other thing I would say, and obviously this isn't everyone, but a lot of people who are really into guns, I mean, there's obviously some cool people who are into them, but there's a lot of dicks who are into guns. They really are. And so that's a factor as well that you never hear in the whole, you know, so, and it's really kind of machismo, you know, so I don't know I'm just getting lost and I'm rambling. Tell me what I should think.
Well, I don't think that we need to necessarily debate it on this show because I've got a couple of more questions from our listeners and I think they just want your view.
Can I just say one thing?
Is this live? Are people listening to this live?
No, it's canned.
But did you tell them?
And in Kapistan,
tell them I was on and then ask them for questions?
Yeah.
Sorry, Tam. Okay,
yeah. And in Kapistan, basically, I'll be allowed to have a gun and you don't have to have one if you don't want one.
Yeah, but here's the problem. If you've got one, I want one. Because
I definitely want one if Tam wants one. Partly because I don't trust him with the fucker. I know what his temper's like. But
how do you know I don't have one already?
But secondly,
The law doesn't. The law only prohibits you. It doesn't inhibit you.
That's true. Well, I feel a little bit inhibited around the law sometimes. So,
when I was in Texas, you'd just be sat in an ordinary cafe, restaurant, something, you know, like having eggs and beans or something for lunch, and there'd be a guy walks in with a fucking gun on his holster, and like you could tell none of the locals bat an eyelid, but I just found it really frightening that there's a bloke sitting there with a weapon with which he could kill me at the next table.
Well, that's why you should have had one as well, Dominic. What the hell?
What if he's better with the gun than I am?
Well, you should have trained as well.
You know,
are you going to let him talk to you like that? Are you going to make him let you and feel intimidated? Come on, get on board with the arms race. You just need to get a bigger gun than he has.
Here's the thing: if you've ever been in a fight when you're younger, like I've been in a few, not a lot, but I've been in a few fights. It takes, like, it's particularly the first time you do it. If you've never done it before, it's really hard to throw a punch. It just takes a certain willpower or something to throw a punch. Either you have to be really hurt or really angry, or you just have to have no sympathy or empathy, but it takes a certain something to be able to throw a punch. And I have to say, don't tell anyone, but I've been in fights and stuff, but I've never actually been able to bring myself to throw a punch. I've been almost too scared or something, too inhibited maybe.
Too late now.
But so like to actually get to that point where you throw a punch takes a certain something. It's easier to just pull out a gun and pull a trigger. It's not the same fear. And yet throwing a punch and pulling a trigger, one does considerably more harm than the other. You know, I bet those kids who go into the schools shooting everyone, you know, they kind of do it and they get almost, you know, the expression is trigger happy. But if they had to go in and actually punch one of the kids, many of them probably couldn't even do it.
I could.
Yeah.
The kids around your way.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I was wondering what your view is on Scottish independence. Well, I wasn't. One of our listeners were.
I'm all for it.
You're for it. Can you explain
I'm massively for it. It's funny because the libertarians in England were all in favour of leaving the European Union. It was very much the libertarians all were mostly in favour of leaving. But when I do the same question, like when I did my game show at the Edinburgh Festival, and I do this, the round of the right answer is my opinion, and I ask the audience which is an independent Scotland or a Great Britain or whatever it is. And all my sort of contrarian Scottish friends would take the line of Great Britain, because in Scotland, it's almost contrary to be in favour of Great Britain rather than to be in favour of independence, certainly in terms of the vocal majority anyway. And it was interesting because I would always I wrote an article in The Independent a few years ago that got loads of readers, basically arguing that I think Scotland should be independent because, firstly, it's small, and if you look at per capita GDP of small countries around the world, it tends to be higher than big countries. And let me backtrack a bit. If you look at the richest countries in the world on a per capita basis, they all have certain things in common. And the richest countries in the world on a per capita basis are like, not in this order necessarily, but it's like Hong Kong, Switzerland, Norway, Qatar, Brunei, all these places. And they're all either financial centers. Singapore's another one. They're all either financial centers or they've got oil. Now, and the other thing they all have in common is they've all got populations of less than 10 million. And Scotland has got the small thing. What's the population of Scotland? 4, 5 million, 6 million, is it?
6 million.
6.5 million.
6 million.
Yeah, 6.
So it's small. It's got that. It's got the whole financial infrastructure thing, you know, and it's got oil. Like, it's got all three. So it's got, you know, if you're designing your Marvel superhero, Scotland's got everything to become a really good, wealthy, independent, free trading nation. The problem that Scotland has is it's got run by loony socialists. But if you can get them out of the way, it's got everything you need. Yeah. And so I was always in favour of it. And I also think just psychologically, it would be better for Scotland to get out of this rut that it's got itself into of really disliking the English and blaming the English for everything. Because do you know what? The English Parliament and the English government might say one thing, but most of the English, if Alex Salmond had opened that vote up and it had been a vote for the entire United Kingdom, the English would have voted in favour of an independent Scotland. It was like, go and be independent and get on with us and stop blaming us for everything. Yeah. And so I find that the great irony that if Salmond lost the vote because he only left it to the Scots. So I'm all in favour of it, but not for the right reasons. I'm in favour of it for libertarian reasons rather than, you know, I've got a map somewhere. I don't know where it is, but in the house where I've redesigned Great Britain according to the Anglo-Saxon heptarchy. So England was divided into 7. This was England at that time. It was divided into 7 kingdoms, but Scotland also was divided into kingdoms, and they divide quite naturally according to the lay of the land. And so they would have been Pictland and I forget what they're all called, but Alba. Exactly. Thank you. And so it divides quite naturally according to those. It's where the mountains are and the rivers are and so on. It all happens quite naturally in Wales, and then Ireland does the same. Ireland had the old 5 kingdoms. And if Ireland went back to 5 kingdoms instead of 2, that would sort out a lot of the Irish problems as well. So, this is a big movement to local. I want local Ancapistans. It needs to be Anglo-Ancapistan, or in your case, Celtistan or something. But so that would happen, and then I'm sure we'd all get on much better.
You have your way of life.
Blaming the English.
I have my way of life.
I mean, did you get on a lot? Didn't you get on a lot better with your wife after the divorce?
We're free trading. We have a free trading operation. Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Antony, do you have another question?
Well, I just wanted to point out that you've got a new song. A lot of people listening who've heard of you know that you're a comedy songwriter, and it's the Lockdown Blues. I just want to get a shout out about that song because people can.
Oh yeah, please go and listen to the song. I'm quite proud of it. It's a good one.
Yeah, and I listened to it before our show, and I think it speaks to quite it reminds me of a time, the Lockdown Blues, it reminds me of a time when I was at uni, and whenever it was term time, I said, hey, I can't wait until the summer so that I can get on with all my projects that I've been putting off. And then when it came to the summer, I was like, I can't wait till term time, so I've got a little bit of structure in my life and I can get on with all the things that I've been putting off. And that's my teaser for your song. Do you have any questions, by the way, Tom?
Yeah, well, I just want to ask on the comedy song thing. It's a notoriously difficult thing to do. I don't think people appreciate how hard it is to actually write a comedy song that's funny. You can do it and it's mildly amusing or whatever, but funny or catchy.
It's really hard.
I know it's a kind of boring comedy question, but who was an influence? Was there any influences on you? Jake Thackeray, Richard Digance?
Well, it's about 2 things there.
Who was your big influence, or who do you look up to in terms of comedy songwriting?
Well, a few people, but just coming back to that thing, if you think of how few really great comedy songs there are, you get an idea of it's just such a difficult form. And a lot of people's favorite comedy songs are reversions of old songs. So you're sort of cashing in on the recognition, and the joke is you're going somewhere else with a song. And I don't count that. I've done it myself a few times, and I think I've done it quite wittily, but I readily accept that it's much harder to write an original song than it is to just reversion something well known. And it really is, and I think it just is very hard to do. And the proof of the fact that it's hard to do is how few really great songs there are. And then you even look at the really great songs, and they're not that funny in a way that watching a really great comic routine is. So, for example, what's a really great comic song? Mad Dogs and Englishmen, or I Am the Very Model of a Modern Major General, or something like that. Not as funny as Tommy Cooper, or Ronnie Barker or something, or some, Laurel and Hardy or whatever it is. So
yeah,
it is really hard. But in answer to your question, who are my big influences? I adore Jake Thackeray. I just think he is the best. But even his stuff is not it's not as funny as Tim Vine or Al Murray or something. It just isn't.
yeah.
But it doesn't mean it's not brilliant. So I love Jake Thackeray. I haven't listened to his stuff for a while, but I used to adore Noel Coward. I love Gilbert and Sullivan. Just adore Gilbert and Sullivan. A lot of people cite Tom Lehrer. I'm like, well, whatever about him. There's a guy called, what's his guy? The sound effects guy, Stan. Oh, I've forgotten his name. And there's a lot of good musical comedians, but what they often do, their comedy is, what was his name? The Danish guy who used to be very good in the 70s. I've forgotten his name. But a lot of their comedy, he was like a director, but a lot of their stuff is deconstructing the music. Like the guy with the beard, Bill.
Was it Stan Freberg you
Bill
were thinking
Bailey.
of?
Stan Freberg. I love Stan Freberg. That's the music.
I don't think Bill
Bailey. Now, Bill Bailey's brilliant, but his comedy is not so much in writing funny songs as it is deconstructing songs and doing clever things and interesting things with them. So, but the actual writers, so there aren't that many, but there are a few, and I've listed some of them. I don't even know who's this guy. You said Richard Devine, or what was his name? Tam, you said someone.
But when I made my first comments, Richard Digance.
Who's Richard Digance? I've never heard of him.
You must know Richard Digance.
I don't know him.
He used to be a regular on Countdown. Check him out. He's not. I don't find him funny in the slightest. I do. I've got my sort of like comedy blog, the satire. I've done a thing about man in Scotland who finds Richard Digance funny. It's like I can't.
Richard Stilgoe
did find him funny at all.
Richard Stilgoe had some witty stuff. There's a lot of witty songs.
Yeah.
But I mean, if you ask me what's a great Richard Stilgoe song, I wouldn't know.
Okay.
But
Victor Borge.
That's the Danish guy. Victor Borge. Yeah. He's great, but again, his stuff's about, like, he starts to play the piano and then it goes wrong, and then he starts getting cross with it. It's that kind of thing, which again, it's great. I love it. I love it. They're not necessarily brilliant comic songs.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay.
Well,
asked and answered.
What is your perspective, Stephen asks, on what the fast food industry will be like after this COVID bullshit?
God knows. I haven't got a clue.
That's what I think. What do you think what will the effects of this be on basically the food industry and things like that? Do you have any predictions?
Well, at the moment, the food industry's, parts of the food industry are doing rather well, supermarkets and local shops and stuff, because all the trade's gone to them, all the restaurant trade, all the pub trade, it's all gone to them. But and so they'll probably, once the crisis starts to pass, you probably want to be long pubs and short supermarkets, if that makes sense. But
I'm definitely looking forward to going back to the pub. It's been a long time.
I can't fucking wait. But in terms of the I don't know what the impact. I've never thought about it, and I'm just going to be talking shit if I talk about it. So I don't.
It's a difficult question to make predictions in this time. I just wanted to chuck it in case you had anything to say.
I mean, why would we not have fast food? Even now, people would have fast food if they could eat it. Surely. I don't.
There you go, Stephen.
I don't know. I don't see it being a problem.
Well, I know that a lot of places who were never doing home deliveries before, the kind of restaurants who would have looked down their nose at home deliveries, are doing them. It's sort of, if anything, that might be a good thing. I've got no idea.
I know these capitalists are ruthless. They'll profiteer over anything. Well, the book
Here's
is
to that.
the most recent book is Daylight Robbery. Kaz Paul's wondering if he wants a signed copy, how does he get one? And I'm sure some of our other listeners might want a signed copy from you as well.
I'll say this: it's the best book I've ever written, I think, and I think it's really good. But one of the things I've noticed, there's this trend where non-fiction sales have just almost stopped since this crisis started. Everyone's buying fiction, which is quite telling. You know, I want to read a good fantasy while I'm in lockdown. And so all the, we want to fix the world, non-fiction. I want to improve myself. All that stuff's just gone out the window in this crisis, which is quite interesting. But even though non-fiction sales have, so it might not be that appetizing to you in the current climate that we're in. But nevertheless, I'm extremely proud of it, and I think it's a terrific book. And it's called Daylight Robbery. And if you go to my website, dominicfrisby.com, and go on the blog, you might have to search through 3 or 4 posts. But you can order a signed copy from me. But here's the thing. Like, if I want to buy a signed copy from my publisher, they will sell me signed copies at 50% of the official retail price. And so the official retail price of the book is 20 quid. So so it costs me a tenner to buy the book. I then have to send it out, which costs me another £3.55. So in total, before I've made any money, I have to spend £13.55. So what I've been doing is I've been selling them for the official retail price, which is 20 quid plus £3.55 postage, which comes to £23.55. But like I say, my break even is £13.55. Amazon sell it for 12 quid.
Right, yeah.
They're undercutting the fucking author. It's just amazing.
Yeah,
so
I'm having the same problem with my book. So I totally sympathize with that. I've been sending them out to the States, and it is quite costly. There's not really much of a margin on it. So I would encourage people to give Dominic his tenner, man. It's just 10 quid. Pay the extra.
I tell you what's really good, actually. If you're into audiobooks, like I earn my living doing voiceovers, and I sort of know what I'm doing, and I'm quite good at it. The audiobook is really good. If you're into audiobooks, buy the audiobook, and then I don't have to get into this competition with Amazon just to make a living.
Are you doing your own audio, or did you draft somebody? Did you get Stephen Fry or something to do?
No. I read it.
Okay,
I read it, but if you look on Audible at the feedback, it's had really good. Everyone really likes it.
Great, and you are accomplished voice actor, so it should come as no surprises. So if you want a signed copy of the book, you'll have to pay for it. It's going to cost you, but the audio book comes critically acclaimed. Thanks so much. Just for anyone who doesn't know, Dominic and the two of us met at the Edinburgh Fringe Festival a good few years ago now, near the first
2016.
year. 2016. Oh, so we'll be coming to our 4-year anniversary of friendship, and we've in August. But yeah, we've been hanging out with Dominic.
Well, it's cancelled.
They've cancelled the festival this year.
And that was something that you wanted to talk about, Tam.
No, I didn't want to talk about that. It's a done deal. Actually, I might enjoy that. Yeah, I could live without it.
I'll tell you what. There's the free fringe that doesn't actually need the official fringe, and if they relax the lockdown rules, the free fringe could go ahead. It could be a really good year for the festival,
right?
Because it will be won't be official. It'll be a bit more
back to basics.
Organic. Yeah, back to basics.
Yeah, back to what it used to be.
Yeah.
Well, I would really love it if the free fringe went ahead. I'd be sad to lose the whole festival. So if that is happening, I guess we'll see you again. And you guys at home, Tam, could you please insert something insightful or hilarious to end the show?
No, I've nothing more to say. Thanks again to Dominic for coming back and being with us. It's been good. We should do it again sometime if we're all alive in the year 25, whatever. Thanks to Dominic. Thanks to you guys for listening. Leave your comments and tune in again next time for the Scottish Liberty podcast. Stay safe.
See you soon. Thanks for having me on.